That sound you're hearing? It's my Geiger counter. I'm 3 levels underground in a decommissioned Cold War missile silo. And that noise? That started right before I realized I wasn't alone. I get strange feelings in the places I explore all the time. It comes with the territory. You feel the weight of history, the chill of a place that's been silent for decades. But this was different. This felt active, hostile. I was there to document a concrete tomb, but it felt like the tomb was awake. And it knew I was there. What I caught on camera that day still keeps me up at night. For years, I've been exploring the skeletons of the Cold War. You see a lot of rusting radar towers and forgotten bunkers, but a Titan I missile silo? That's the main event. The one near Lincoln, California, was only active for about 3 years, from 62 to 65. It's a monster of steel and concrete, built to survive anything short of a direct nuclear hit. After it was decommissioned, the Army Corps of Engineers took it over. The official records mention chemical contamination, stuff like industrial solvents, but nothing about radiological hazards. It was supposed to be safe. I brought my Geiger counter anyway. The entrance is just this gaping wound in the earth, a concrete staircase spiraling down into pure black. With every step, the air got colder, thicker. It smelled like damp earth and rot. The upper levels were the usual story of a place left behind. Peeling paint, dumb graffiti, and the kind of silence that comes when the world moves on. My Geiger counter was just giving off these soft, occasional clicks. Totally normal background radiation. It was actually kind of comforting. I was filming everything. Control panels with their switches frozen in time. Massive blast doors that hadn't swung shut in over 50 years. There was even a phone dangling off its hook, waiting for a call that was never going to come. The whole place just felt empty, like a massive, hollow shell. That feeling didn't last. The last staircase takes you down to the silo's deepest level, 160 feet underground. The temperature just plummeted. I could see my own breath in my flashlight beam. And down here, the silence was different. It felt heavy, oppressive. It was the kind of quiet that feels like it's listening to you. My Geiger counter, which had been pretty calm, started clicking more. Not a steady rhythm, but this nervous, irregular pattern. I swept my flashlight down the corridor. Nothing. Just concrete and dancing shadows. At the far end, a heavy steel door was cracked open. A stenciled sign above it read, "Authorized personnel only." I gave it a push. The room inside was small and stark. There was a battered metal table in the middle and a mess of thick cables on the floor. The air was thick with this sharp chemical smell that burned my nostrils. I stepped over the threshold, and the Geiger counter went absolutely insane. It wasn't clicking anymore. It was screaming. A solid, piercing shriek as the needle slammed hard into the red. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I just froze, trying to make sense of it. I scanned the room for a source. Was there a barrel? A weird stain on the floor? Anything that could explain the reading? But there was nothing. Just bare concrete walls. I backed out of the room, and the counter immediately went quiet. I just stood there in the corridor, my mind racing. Was it a malfunction? Maybe interference from some old wiring? I had to be sure. I took a deep breath and stepped back inside. The shriek was instant, filling that small room with its awful alarm. My hands were shaking, but I lifted my camera. I had to get this on film. The flash lit up the room in these harsh, sterile bursts. I tried to focus on what I was doing, but that feeling of being watched was just crushing me. There was this cold pressure building in my chest. I took a few more pictures and then I just fled, scrambling back up those stairs with that alarm echoing in my head. That night, in some cheap motel room, I loaded the photos onto my laptop. The first few images from the upper levels were perfectly fine. Then, I got to the pictures from that little room. In the first shot, I saw it. A pale, blurry shape near the far wall. I told myself it was just a lens flare, a trick of the light. But in the next photo, it had moved. These shapes were in every single picture from that room. They were faint, blurred figures that didn't look like ghosts. They looked like glitches in reality. Their limbs were warped and elongated, their features smudged out like static. They were clustered around the table, lurking in the corners. I know high radiation can create noise and white dots in a digital photo, but this was something else. This was structured. And in the very last photo, the one I snapped as I was turning to run, one of them was standing in the doorway. I drove back a week later. I think I needed to prove to myself that I'd imagined it all. But the entrance to the lowest level was blocked. A brand new heavy-duty padlock was on the door, with a fresh sign warning of hazardous contamination. I put my ear against the cold steel and just listened. I can't be sure, but I think I heard a faint clicking sound coming from the other side. Since then, I never went back. The site is still there, holding on to its secrets. I have the photos, and I have the memory of that sound. Sometimes, when my own house is quiet, I swear I can still hear it. That slow, rhythmic click of a Geiger counter. A sound that tells you something unseen is getting closer. And I wonder, what's still moving in the shadows of that cold, dead place? The official report is spotless. It calls our job a routine structural decommission. Lists the site as stable. The shaft is empty. It says the contract was fulfilled without a single problem. But reports can be sanitized. Words can be erased. We're the ones who stood at the edge of that hole. We're the ones who saw what was on that camera feed, right before they killed the power and told us all to forget it ever happened. The government told us the silo was empty. That was a lie. My name is Frank, and for 20 years, my job has been specialized demolition. We're the crew you call when a job is too weird or too secret for a standard team. We've torn down old labs, sealed forgotten bunkers, and dismantled buildings that weren't on any map. You get used to it. You sign the NDA, you take the hazard pay, and you learn to keep your damn mouth shut. But this job, this one felt different right from the start. The contract came from a third-party guy, a man in a crisp suit who called himself Mr. Jones. He looked like he'd never seen a day of hard labor in his life and was completely out of place in our dusty little office. The job sounded simple enough. Permanently seal an old Atlas F missile silo out in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska. These things were Cold War relics, built in the 60s and abandoned just a few years later. Concrete and steel tombs sleeping under the prairie. The site has been dormant for over 50 years, Mr. Jones said, his voice totally flat. Your objective is simple. Confirm the shaft is clear. Check for any major structural problems, and then weld the main hatch shut. We'll handle filling it with concrete later. My foreman, Pete, a guy who's seen it all, leaned forward. What kind of clear are we talking about? Any chemical hazards? Old fuel? Mr. Jones managed a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. Nothing like that. The silo was fully decommissioned, cleaned out, according to protocol. It's just an empty tube, about 180 feet deep. Think of this as a formality. He must have said the word empty 3 or 4 times in that meeting. It was a warning, not a description. A week later, our 4-man team was rattling down a dirt road at sunrise. Just me, Pete, and 2 younger guys, Marco and Dave, who were still green enough to think this was an adventure. The site was just what you'd expect. A flat, empty landscape with nothing but a huge, circular concrete slab sitting almost flush with the ground. The tombstone for a weapon that could have cracked the world in half. The wind just screamed across the plains, and it carried this weird metallic tang with it. The smell of cold, damp earth. The silence out there just felt heavy. Popping the main hatch was our first problem. It was a multi-ton slab of steel and concrete, rusted shut after half a century. It took a cutting torch and a winch, and the whole time it groaned, and shrieked until it finally scraped open with a shudder we felt in our teeth. The second it opened, a blast of air rushed out. It was freezing cold, and it stank so bad we all took a step back. It wasn't just rust and damp concrete. There was something else in there. Something organic, sour. It smelled like an animal cage that hadn't been cleaned in a long, long time. "Smells like something died down there," Dave muttered, pulling his shirt over his nose. Pete just grunted. "Everything down there is dead, kid." But then, as we were clearing dirt from around the entrance, we found the first thing that was really wrong. Tucked right under the concrete lip was a crumpled chip bag and a water bottle. And they weren't 50 years old. The plastic was new. The logos were modern. They were weeks old, at most. Squatters, maybe? Marco asked, but you could hear the doubt in his voice. Pete shook his head. He pointed to the massive government issue lock we just torched off. No chance. This thing was sealed tight. Nobody's been in or out this way for decades. A really uncomfortable silence fell over the crew. We were all just standing at the edge of this perfect circle of blackness, plunging straight down into the earth. Pete set up a high-intensity work light and started lowering it into the shaft. The beam sliced through the dark, lighting up the curved concrete walls. We could see rust-colored streaks running down them like old blood. We saw the skeletons of old catwalks and ladders, rusted to hell. The light kept going down, deeper and deeper, until it was just this tiny star, 180 feet below us. It lit up the bottom, and that bad feeling we all had? It twisted into cold dread. It wasn't just rubble down there. It was a nest. A crude, disgusting nest made of torn blankets, old insulation, and filthy rags. And right in the middle of it was a stained pillow and a tattered duffel bag. Someone or something had been living down there, and not long ago. Nobody was joking about squatters anymore. Nobody wanted to go down that ladder. Pete, his face like stone, made the call. Get the inspection camera. Not one of us is going down there until we see what we're dealing with. We had a fiber optic camera on a long cable, the kind you use for pipes. I watched the grainy black and white feed on the monitor as Marco carefully fed the line down. The trip down was hypnotic, terrifying. We drifted past the skeletal remains of old platforms, the camera swinging and giving us these glimpses into the absolute blackness just beyond our light. Finally, it hit the bottom, hovering a few feet off the floor. The nest was even worse up close, and all around it there were bones. Small ones at first, maybe birds or a coyote. But then the camera panned a little to the left, and we all saw it. A rib cage, way too big for a coyote. It was picked clean, but you couldn't mistake the shape. It was human. Mr. Jones, who'd been hanging back, was suddenly right behind me, his eyes glued to the screen. His knuckles were white where he was gripping my chair. That's when we heard it. A low, scraping sound echoed up from the shaft. It wasn't metal on concrete. It was wet, heavy. The sound of something being dragged. On the screen, right at the edge of the light, a shadow moved. It pulled itself out of the deeper darkness and became a shape. It was pale, almost glowing in the camera's light. It was crouched on all fours, its body starved and all wrong. Its arms and legs were just impossibly long and thin, bent at angles a person shouldn't be able to bend. It moved with this jerky, unnatural crawl, like a broken marionette. As it crept into the light, we saw its skin. It was gray, totally hairless, and stretched tight over a twisted skeleton. It stopped. It sensed the camera, and it slowly lifted its head. The face was a nightmare. The mouth was too wide, filled with tiny, needle-like teeth. But the eyes... God, the eyes were the worst part. They were huge, perfectly black, with no pupils, no iris. Just two black holes that reflected our camera's light back as tiny, sterile dots. And as it stared right into the lens, we saw it wasn't some dumb animal. There was a terrifying, cold intelligence in that gaze. It knew we were up here. It was watching us. For about 5 seconds, the whole world just stopped. All you could hear was the hum of our generator and the sight of this thing staring back at us. Then it opened its mouth and screamed. It's a sound I'll hear in my sleep for the rest of my life. It was a shriek that was part human agony, part grinding metal, and part predator's roar. It hit us like a punch. As the scream was still echoing, the creature scrambled forward with impossible speed, its long clawed fingers reaching for our camera. Pull it up now," Pete yelled. Marco yanked on the cable with everything he had. The feed on the monitor exploded into static and then went black. All hell broke loose. Dave stumbled back and threw up in the grass. Marco was shaking, his face sheet white. Pete, a guy I'd never seen scared in my life, was just swearing, his eyes wide. And Mr. Jones? He was already on a satellite phone, his back to us, his voice low and fast. "This is Jones. Execute contingency Pilgrim. I repeat, Pilgrim is a go. The asset is active. I say again, the asset is hostile. The site is compromised. Asset? Contingency? You don't use those words for a squatter. You use them for an experiment that got loose." We were ordered, not asked, to get away from the silo. Now, less than 20 minutes later, 2 unmarked black helicopters roared in over the horizon. They landed in a storm of dust and grass, and men in full hazmat suits and carrying assault rifles rappelled out before the skids even touched down. This wasn't a cleanup crew. This was a military containment unit. They escorted us to our truck and kept us there. Then came the debriefing, which is just a nice word for being threatened. A new guy in military fatigues told us that we'd experienced a mass psychogenic event. A shared hallucination, he said, probably caused by a pocket of toxic gas. He told us our equipment malfunctioned. He told us we couldn't trust our own memories. While he was talking, I heard one of the soldiers near the silo. The wind carried his voice. ... single quotes Tino, how it breached CRYO-containment ... The feeding system must have failed years ago ... They made us sign new NDAs, way thicker than the first ones. The penalties were spelled out in chilling detail. Then they paid us double our contract fee in cash. It wasn't a payment. It was an order to shut up. The last thing Mr. Jones said to us was, "This never happened. For your own safety and the safety of your families, you will believe our story." We drove away from that concrete slab as the containment team got ready to bury it for good. We never talked about it again. Not to our families, not even to each other. It was like if we didn't say it out loud, it couldn't be real. And God, we all wanted it to not be real. But I know what I saw. I know the government didn't just lie about the silo being empty. The bigger lie was that it was contained. I quit the demolition business a month after that. I just can't do enclosed spaces anymore. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is dead quiet, I'll hear a faint scratching from under the floorboards. I tell myself it's just the house settling. I know that, but I still freeze and my blood runs cold. Every time I close my eyes, I see that pale, twisted face. I see those 2 bottomless black eyes staring out of the dark. And one terrifying thought always follows. Something that hungry and that smart doesn't stay locked away forever. It just waits. It finds another way out. You know how they say radio waves never really die? That they just drift forever in the static, waiting for someone to tune in. I'm starting to think they're right. Because deep beneath the Kansas prairie, in a forgotten Cold War silo, I found an old radio. And I heard a warning that should have faded out 40 years ago. A warning that was still counting down. I've always been drawn to these places, these concrete ghosts of the Cold War. So, when I stumbled on the coordinates for a decommissioned missile site, I mean, how could I not go? The main entrance was flooded, half swallowed by rust-colored water, but I eventually found another way in. The moment I stepped inside, this wave of cold, dead air hit me. It was thick with the smell of decay and old, sleeping machinery. My flashlight cut a nervous beam through the dark, lighting up corridors where lead paint was peeling off in sheets. I passed control rooms where consoles sat like skeletons, their glass dials all shattered. Honestly, I was just looking for a few relics, a piece of history I could hold in my hand. I had no idea that history was about to find me first. And that's when I saw it. Tucked away in a damp corner of the main command center was an old military receiver. It was this heavy, olive green beast, all chipped and faded. Most of the other equipment in the room was smashed to pieces, but this was almost perfect. The dial still turned with this incredibly satisfying, heavy click. I couldn't just leave it there. I had a portable battery pack in my bag. I tinker with electronics. It's my thing. It felt like a total long shot, but I started splicing wires and scraping years of corrosion off the contacts. My fingers were getting numb from the cold. For almost an hour, there was nothing. Just the thick, heavy silence of the tomb all around me. Then a crackle. It was faint, just a hiss that slowly grew into a roar of static. I felt this jolt of pure victory. I'd actually done it. I started turning the main tuning dial, sweeping slowly, carefully through the frequencies. The static shifted and warped, and then a tone started to emerge. It was a long, piercing emergency wail that made every hair on my body stand on end. A voice followed, its tone flat, urgent, and unnervingly clear. This is an emergency broadcast. Soviet missiles inbound. Seek shelter immediately. Repeat. Soviet missiles inbound. Estimated impact. 15 minutes. My blood just went cold. I stared at the radio. There was a small, flickering digital display I hadn't even noticed before, and on it was the transmission timestamp. November 2nd, 1983. It had to be a loop. A recording, right? A ghost in the machine. An audio relic of a crisis that never happened. I felt this weird mix of total awe and relief. But the voice just kept repeating the same awful, dread-soaked words over and over. I pulled out my phone to try and record it, but of course, I had no signal. I was deep underground. I figured I'd scan the other bands, just to see what else was out there. Nothing. Just dead air. I turned the dial back to the original frequency, and the broadcast was still there. The siren, the voice. But something was different. The voice hesitated for just a split second, almost like it knew I was listening. Then it spoke again. Estimated impact, 14 minutes. I froze. No, that can't be right. I must have misheard it the first time. I checked my watch. A minute had passed. It wasn't a loop. This wasn't a recording. The countdown was live. It was happening right now, in this bunker. And maybe, just for me. The air got heavy, and the temperature seemed to drop even more. I stumbled back from the radio, my heart pounding against my ribs. Pure panic set in. I scrambled for the exit, but the corridors all looked the same, twisting and turning. Every corner I took felt wrong, like it was leading me deeper into the silo's concrete guts. My flashlight started to flicker, which didn't help, casting these frantic dancing shadows on the peeling walls. And the voice, it wasn't just on the radio anymore. I could hear it echoing from the old intercom speakers. It felt like it was coming from the walls themselves. 10 minutes. I just ran. I don't know for how long. I just remember the sudden sharp shock of cold night air and collapsing onto wet grass. Gasping for breath under a silent, starry sky. A moment later, my phone buzzed back to life in my pocket. No alerts, no breaking news. The world was exactly how I'd left it. But sometimes, when it's late and the house is quiet, I can still hear it. That faint, urgent voice in the static. And I can't help but wonder, Was it just an echo of a war that never happened? Or is that countdown somewhere deep beneath the earth, still running, just waiting for the next person to listen in?